What if one of the most quoted promises of Jesus was never meant to describe passive asking at all? Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and they shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. Most of us have heard Matthew 7:7 so many times that we no longer stop to examine what is actually happening inside those words. We hear a comforting promise. Ask God for something, believe, wait, and eventually receive. But when we move closer to the Semitic world in which Jesus taught, something much more demanding begins to emerge. The sentence contains not one passive request, but three movements: asking, seeking, and knocking. And those movements may completely change the way you understand prayer. Behind this teaching are three ancient ideas we will explore as SHIO, Bayu, and QUSHUS, seek and knock. But their importance is not simply that they provide different words for something you already know. Together, they reveal a progression. A person begins with a question, moves into pursuit, and eventually arrives at a door where action becomes unavoidable. This is why the teaching becomes so powerful when restored to its original cultural and linguistic setting. Jesus was not describing a spiritual vending machine where desire goes in and blessings come out. He was describing what happens when prayer awakens participation. And there is one detail hidden in the sequence that changes everything. Why did Jesus need three commands if asking alone were enough? Why say seek after ask? And why command someone who is already seeking to knock? Stay with me, because when we reach the final movement QUSHU, you may discover that Matthew 7:7 is not primarily teaching you how to wait for an answer. It may be teaching you how to become the person capable of walking toward it. The familiar English sentence can easily place our attention on the rewards. It will be given, you will find, the door will open. But notice where Jesus begins. He begins with verbs. Ask, seek, knock. Before there is receiving, there is asking. Before finding, there is seeking. Before an opening, there is knocking. The structure itself suggests movement. Each command requires something more from the listener than the command before it. Asking can begin with the voice. Seeking requires attention and direction. Knocking requires you to arrive somewhere and place your hand against the door. This matters because many people have unconsciously reduced prayer to the first movement. They ask. They repeat the request. They wait. And when nothing changes, they conclude that God has remained silent. Yet Matthew 7:7 does not stop after ask. The teaching continues. The listener is invited from request into pursuit. In the Semitic world behind the gospel tradition, words were often understood through concrete action. Spiritual truth was not separated from the way a person walked, searched, chose, responded, and persevered. Faith was something that entered life. Consider how different this becomes when applied to an ordinary struggle. Someone asks for wisdom concerning a relationship. That is SHL. But then comes Bayu. Seek. Pay attention. Examine what has been ignored. Listen carefully. Look for truth rather than merely for the answer you hoped to receive. Then comes Q. USHU. Knock. There may eventually be a conversation that must happen, a boundary that must be established, an apology that must be offered, or a decision that can no longer be postponed. Suddenly Matthew 7:7 is not simply about receiving things from heaven. It describes a relationship between prayer and participation. The answer may begin while you are still asking, but recognizing it can require seeking, and entering what has been revealed can require knocking. That is why the order matters. Shall Bayu, QUSHU. Not three repetitions of the same idea. Three stages of spiritual movement. The first movement is SHAL. At first, this appears to be the easiest command, but genuine asking requires something deeper than speaking a desire aloud. To ask sincerely, you must first recognize that you do not possess the entire answer. Asking begins with humility. It is the moment when certainty loosens its grip and the human heart becomes willing to receive direction from beyond its own assumptions. This explains why asking can be spiritually uncomfortable. Sometimes we do not really ask. We present God with a conclusion we have already chosen. We say, "Show me the way," while secretly hoping only one particular path will be confirmed. But the ancient movement of asking creates openness. The question becomes real only when you are willing to receive an answer different from the one you expected. SHAL, therefore, becomes more than a request for something. It becomes a posture of receptivity. Look again at the teaching of Jesus. He does not condemn asking. He commands it. There is nothing spiritually mature about pretending you have no questions, no needs, and no uncertainty. The first movement begins precisely where human limitation is acknowledged. Ask. Bring the question into the light. Name what you need. Admit what you cannot see. But then remember, Jesus does not end the teaching there. This is where many readings stop too early. We have been taught to emphasize the promise attached to asking while overlooking the command that immediately follows it. Once the question has been spoken, the listener must become attentive. The prayer that begins with the mouth is about to involve the eyes, the mind, the choices, and eventually the feet. And this is precisely why recovering even one ancient word can open an entirely different understanding of a familiar teaching. If SHAL already makes you wonder how much meaning can disappear when the original language is reduced to a single English word, the Aramaic wisdom collection was created for that deeper exploration. It brings these ancient expressions and their spiritual context together so you can continue studying beyond this episode. You can find the collection through the first pinned comment or scan the QR code on your screen. Now the teaching changes direction. Shall gives way to Bayou. Seek. This second movement is crucial because seeking cannot happen without participation. Imagine losing something precious inside your home. You may ask where it is, but eventually you stand up. You look beneath what has been overlooked. You open drawers. You revisit places you assumed were empty. Seeking transforms the question into movement. Spiritually, the same principle applies. Sometimes people ask for clarity while repeatedly ignoring the evidence already surrounding them. They ask for direction but refuse to investigate the path. They ask for peace while continuing habits that constantly disturb the mind. They ask for reconciliation while avoiding the conversation that could begin it. Bayou confronts this contradiction. Seeking means becoming available to discover something you did not already know. Notice how frequently Jesus connected spiritual understanding with eyes that see and ears that hear. His teaching continually called people into awareness. The kingdom was not merely something to discuss. It was something to recognize. Seeking, therefore, requires attention. What is happening around you? What pattern keeps repeating? What truth have you been avoiding because accepting it would require change? This does not mean every difficulty has a simple solution or that every unanswered prayer exists because someone failed to act. That would distort the teaching. There are mysteries, losses, illnesses, and circumstances beyond human control. But within the territory where we can respond, Bayou reminds us that prayer and attentiveness belong together. Today, take one unresolved question and write it down in a single sentence. First, practice SHEL. Ask without dictating the answer. Then practice Bayou. Identify 3 places where wisdom might already be available. Scripture, an honest conversation, a neglected responsibility, a pattern you have noticed, or a practical step you have postponed. For the next 24 hours, do not obsessively demand a sign. Simply become attentive. Ask clearly. Seek deliberately. Notice honestly, because the third movement begins when seeking finally brings you to a door. The third command is QUSH. You knock. This is where the teaching becomes intensely practical. You cannot knock on a door from across the street. You must approach it. Seeking has brought you somewhere. Now you stand before a boundary separating your present condition from what may exist beyond it. And the command of Jesus is not merely to stare at the door. Knock. A door is an extraordinary image because it contains both possibility and uncertainty. You cannot fully see what is beyond it. You may suspect, you may hope, you may fear, but the threshold remains until some action occurs. In ordinary life, these doors often appear as decisions. You prayed for direction, sowed wisdom, and eventually recognized the conversation you need to have. That conversation is the door. You asked for a new beginning, explored possibilities, and discovered an opportunity requiring courage. That opportunity is the door. This does not mean forcing every door open. Kushu is knocking, not breaking. That distinction matters. There is humility even in action. You approach, you respond, you test what has been revealed, but you do not attempt to control every outcome. A knock acknowledges that something beyond you must still answer. And now the three commands begin to form a complete spiritual rhythm. Shall opens the heart. Bayu opens the eyes. Kushu moves the hand. The person who began with a question is no longer standing where the prayer began. Something has changed even before the door opens. The seeker has become more attentive, more engaged, more willing to respond. Perhaps this is one reason the teaching has survived for centuries. It does not merely promise an outcome. It forms the person pursuing that outcome. And sometimes the greatest answer to prayer begins with what happens inside the person who keeps walking toward the door. Imagine beginning with knocking without first asking or seeking. You might spend your life pounding on doors that were never connected to your deepest question. Action without discernment becomes impulsiveness. Now imagine asking without seeking. Prayer can become endless repetition without attention. Or imagine seeking forever without knocking. Knowledge accumulates, possibilities multiply, but nothing is ever entered. The wisdom lies in the sequence. Ask, seek, knock. Each stage corrects the weakness of the others. Asking without seeking risks passivity. Seeking without asking can become knocking without either can become restless action. Together, however, they create a balanced movement between dependence, discernment, and participation. This pattern appears repeatedly in the teachings of Jesus. People come with questions, but the response often invites them into something they must do. Notice, abandon, forgive, carry, follow, or become. His teachings rarely allow the listener to remain a spectator. The encounter demands response. Think about a question you have carried for months or even years. Perhaps you have sincerely asked about it many times. Now ask another question. Have you moved into the second stage? Have you sought understanding beyond your existing assumptions? And if you have sought, has that search already brought you to a threshold you are afraid to approach? Sometimes we say, "I am waiting for God," when beneath those words lies another truth. We already know the next faithful step, but we are afraid of what might happen after taking it. Kushu does not guarantee that every door will open exactly as we desire. It teaches us to approach the door faithfully, because unanswered doors can also become guidance. A closed door can redirect seeking. An opened door can begin a new journey, and either way, the person who asks, seeks, and knocks is no longer spiritually asleep. There is another reason this distinction matters. When ask, and you shall receive is isolated from the rest of the passage, prayer can quietly become transactional. I ask, God gives. If I do not receive what I requested, something must have gone wrong. Perhaps I lacked faith. Perhaps I used the wrong words. Perhaps I did not pray strongly enough. But the complete movement taught by Jesus resists that interpretation. Prayer is not magic. An ancient word is not a magical formula. Pronouncing shall, bayu, or kushu does not force reality to obey you. Their value lies in the world of meaning. They help us recover. They remind us that ancient spiritual language often carried movement, relationship, responsibility, and lived response. This distinction protects the teaching from becoming superstition. The purpose of returning to Aramaic is not to replace one formula with another, supposedly more powerful formula. It is to recover dimensions of meaning that translation can sometimes flatten. Imagine someone praying for wisdom about work. Shal means the question is brought honestly before God. Bayu means the person begins researching, listening, learning, observing opportunities, examining motives, and seeking counsel. Qush. You may eventually mean sending the application, making the call, beginning the project, or declining an opportunity that contradicts what has been discovered. The spiritual and practical movements are not enemies. They meet. And that may be one of the most important recoveries from this passage. Jesus does not invite the listener into passive spirituality. Neither does he glorify frantic human effort. Instead, The three movements create a rhythm between openness and action. You ask because you do not know everything. You seek because answers require attention. You knock because eventually truth asks something from you. There is still one final mystery. When people begin this journey, they usually imagine that the door at the end will look exactly like the answer they requested at the beginning. But seeking can change the seeker. What you thought you needed during SHEAll may look different after Bayou has exposed what was hidden. Perhaps you asked for a particular opportunity, but discovered that what you truly needed was courage. Perhaps you asked for someone else to change, and discovered a pattern within yourself that required attention. Perhaps you asked for certainty, but found that the next step required trust rather than complete explanation. This is why the progression is transformative. The question begins the journey, but it does not control the destination. By the time you reach QUSHU, you may be standing before a door you never imagined when you first prayed. And there is something deeply consistent with the teaching of Jesus here. Again and again, people approached him expecting one kind of answer and encountered a deeper question about faith, identity, forgiveness, attachment, courage, or the kingdom of God. The visible request often became an entrance into an invisible transformation. So return to your own unresolved question. What have you asked? Where have you genuinely sought? And what door has appeared? Do not rush those questions. Sometimes recognizing the door is itself part of the answer. What we have uncovered through SHER and QUSHU is only one doorway into the linguistic world surrounding the teachings of Jesus. If you want to continue exploring these ancient expressions and the meanings behind them, the Aramaic Wisdom Collection was created for that journey. You can find it through the first pinned comment or scan the QR code on your screen. Now we can return to the mystery with which we began. Why did Jesus give 3 commands when asking alone would have been easier? Because the teaching describes a journey. Shall, ask. Begin with honesty. Admit that you do not see everything. Bring the question before God without pretending you already know what the answer must look like. Then, Bayou, seek. Open your eyes. Become attentive. Study. Listen. Examine your motives. Notice patterns. Receive wisdom even when it challenges what you originally wanted to hear. And finally, Kushu, knock. Approach the threshold that your seeking has revealed. Take the faithful step available to you while accepting that you cannot control what happens beyond the door. Now Matthew 7:7 sounds different. The promise remains beautiful, but the listener is no longer passive. Prayer becomes a movement that involves the whole person: voice, attention, discernment, courage, and action. Perhaps there is something in your life right now that you have been asking about repeatedly. Do not stop praying, but ask yourself where you are within these 3 movements. Maybe you are still at SHAL, and the question needs to become honest. Maybe you have reached Bayou, and it is time to stop demanding immediate certainty and begin paying attention. Or perhaps you already know where the door is, and your next movement is QUSH. You knock. Not because every door must open, not because you can command God or control the future, but because faith was never meant to leave you standing forever at the place where the question began. The ancient teaching leads forward. Ask with humility. Seek with attention. Knock with courage. And remember this: sometimes the answer is not merely what waits beyond the door. Sometimes part of the answer is the person you become while walking toward it. If this teaching changed the way you understand these words, write Bayou, QUSHU, in the comments below. And if you want to continue uncovering the ancient Aramaic world behind the teachings of Jesus, subscribe and join me in the next revelation.